Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week. We're going to talk about China now, and we'll start with a map of China. So there's a zoomed-in map of the whole country. You shouldn't be confused when you look at a sort of a world map. It looks like China is somewhat smaller than it actually is, but it is a rather large country. With these are provinces, but you can think of them like states, like sort of like United States of China, if you will. So there's the different sort of governing provinces. Um, Beijing is up here. That's the modern capital. It's been the capital for quite a long time. And where we really want to start with China is before World War II. So China had been ruled by a series of dynasties. And when we talk about dynasties, not like the Patriots as a football dynasty or the Bulls in the 90s as a basketball dynasty. We're talking about ruling dynastic families, the last of which would have been the Qing dynasty, which ended in 1911. And China had historically, for over 2,000 years, been ruled by a succession of dynasties. I encourage you to take a World Civ course if you can to learn a little bit more about it. Dr. Anderson in the department does Chinese history better than anybody, so I really encourage you to look into some of his stuff. So the Qing dynasty, though, it ends in 1911. After at the end of the dynasty, China tries to create this republic, and there's two sort of competing ideologies about which way to go. So 1911 is rough. I mean, it's think about it in terms of where we started this class. It is a little bit earlier because we started with World War I just a little bit. This is right before World War I, so afterwards there's sort of a division within the country about which side they want to go to. On the one hand, we have these difficult to pronounce names for me, at least. I'm sorry. I read an article recently about how white teachers who struggle to pronounce foreign names make foreign students feel bad. So I'm really not trying to do that. I just struggle with with some of these foreign-sounding names. So I'll give it a stab here: the Kuomintang, or the GMD for short. Sometimes they just call these the nationalists. They're led by this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, who, when you translate Chinese into English, it just doesn't work all that smoothly. So sometimes you'll see his name written as Chiang Kai-shek, and other times it'll be Jiang Jiaxi. So it is, I mean, you can go with either. Typically, I say Chiang Kai-shek. And on the other side, we have the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. They're led by this guy named Mao Zedong. Here are their senior portraits from high school. Chiang Kai-shek in his brilliant sort of military regalia, and Mao Zedong, who kind of looks like just like the everyday Chinese worker, at least in the early days. This is a younger picture of him later on. He looks old and fat, but we'll get there in a little while. So after 1911, there is this period where nobody is sure in which direction the Chinese government is going to go, and this lasts for a couple of decades each. And there's this pause period when World War II happens because China was invaded by Japan. So Japan, which is sort of over here, had invaded. They took over North Korea and South Korea, which at that time were just Korea. We talked about the Korean War, and we'll, I think, mention it again, at least at one point. But they also take over this northern area, which is known as Manchuria. So there's a long period of occupation where so there had been this sort of civil war going on for a couple of decades between the GMD and the CCP, trying to figure out who was going to take over power of the country. But they put it on pause during World War II because they were fighting the Japanese, so China had to come together to fight Japan. Later on, the Communist Party claims more credit for helping defeat the Japanese than I think they deserve, because it really was the nationalists, with the help of the United States, naturally. There was a lot more U.S. involvement in World War II than I think we previously learned about, like in high school and stuff. But there is this long period of civil war, and it does look like the nationalists are going to win for a while, but Chiang Kai-shek, he kind of sucks. He's pretty corrupt. He cannot win the hearts and minds of the people. He just doesn't speak to the people. If we go back to his picture here, he looks not like he's one of the people, while Mao looks like every other Chinese person, at least in terms of how they're dressed. But in 1949, so by 1949, the Communist Party does win. And if you had told people at the end of the Civil War, nobody would have believed it. The U.S. and the Soviet Union had supported the nationalists. So there's this long period of uncertainty in China, but it does end with the Communist Party winning. So just to talk about Chiang Kai-shek for a second, his corruption, for example, He just printed money to pay for World War II. Like that was his idea, and we know because we've all taken economics or at least know a little bit about it. When you just sort of print money, that leads to inflation, which is not good for anybody. So he just prints this money up. He's a pretty corrupt guy. There's just one example there. The communists, on the other hand, they just connect better with the peasants. They speak to what the peasants care about. The peasants have been starving for quite a while, and they're interested in eating again. And the communists talk about, these communist ideals: bread for everybody, land for everybody, collectivization. So the Communist Party does do better with regular everyday people. They had originally followed the Soviet model. Initially, Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Communist Party, had wanted to use the Soviet economic model, um, which would mean collective farming and this command economy of industrialization. It wasn't it, so that's the model that they went with, but it doesn't work super well in China for the first couple of years. And then there's this period where the Communist Party moved away from this a little bit after shit. They went to Chinese intellectuals to try and figure out how to make it work better. So the Chinese Communist Party went to educated people, people like you who attended college classes to try and figure out how to fix this Chinese command economy with some collective farming and the command style industrialization. But by 1957, Mao shuts it all down and sends intellectuals to labor re-education camps, which I guess you would associate with a totalitarian regime. And that's, I think, what we want to say about Chinese communism is that they adopt capitalism eventually, but they always retain this totalitarianism that is sort of synonymous with communism in our minds. It's not supposed to be that way, but it is that way. Mao, for his part, decides to mobilize the masses, in air quotes. And what he means here is mobilizing rural peasants. The vast majority of Chinese people were rural peasants, meaning they lived in rural areas working on their own little farms. And by 1959, he announces what's called the Great Leap Forward. This was a collectivization of agriculture, and he decides to build these massive, massive state-run farms that would have about 5 to 10,000 households on one single farm. So there's also, as part of the Great Leap Forward, this idea of moving people toward industry. So it's moving people into larger scale production of agriculture and industry. Another part of this leap is social. He wants to get rid of that old idea of the traditional family unit. Think to your sociology classes. When in the United States, we mostly live in nuclear families with mom, dad, and the kids. In China, the idea had traditionally been sort of these extended families where grandparents would live with children who would live with their grandchildren also. So these sort of larger family units. And Mao wants that to kind of go away. He wants everybody to live together collectively, taking care of the elderly collectively. So it's more of a, so it is some kind of social leap as well. And what this Great Leap Forward actually does is it fails. It's an economic and a social failure. It's a disaster for agriculture. The farms with 5 to 10,000 households working on each farm, and that being 4 to 5 people per household. So let's do the math on that one. They're just too big to run. Nobody can run them effectively just because they're so big. So 1958, 1959, there's these crop failure years. Sometimes crops were just not planted or harvested because the farms were too big, and nobody knew how to run them at that period. And so that lasted about 2 years. And then in 1960 and 1961, the weather wasn't cooperating, and maybe some students in the class who are farmers can tell us a little bit more in the weekly comments section that we have what weather has to do with farming, because you need good weather to farm. So maybe any of you farmers, feel free to jump in and let us know how weather influences crop production. So during this sort of 4-year period of the Great Leap Forward, it's a failure, like we said, but it's kind of a big failure because the estimates, and these are just estimates because nobody is 100% sure, is that between 15 and 30 million people starve in China. And to put that in perspective, what are there, about 20,000 students that attend UNCG? So like that times times 100, if I'm doing my math right. And I think that equals out to about 20 million. So somewhere in that range. It's just quite a lot of people. That's more people than live in North Carolina would have starved at this time. And now that brings us to worldwide communism. So you think that China, now that they're a communist country, would get along really well with the Soviet Union, but it doesn't really go that way. We get a break between China and the Soviet Union in 1960. The Soviets ended up breaking away from China. So this was kind of a big deal, but in the United States, just to put this on the different perspective here, the United States saw them as close allies just because they were both communist countries, and as far as the United States was concerned, everybody who's communist is working together. But the Soviets, for their part, publicly said that the Great Leap Forward was a joke because it killed so many people. And Khrushchev just wanted to get along with the capitalist world as best he could. So Soviet advisors had pulled out of China, so they weren't there to advise the Chinese on how to run their communist totalitarian style society anymore. Mao, for his part, wanted to keep the revolutionary spirit going. And just to say what that really means is that as part of communist ideology, there's supposed to be a worldwide revolution kind of constantly going on until the whole world is communist. So that's what we mean when we're talking about Mao wants this revolutionary spirit to keep going. But in 1961, Mao Zedong just sort of disappears for 5 years. Not that he left China or anything, he just doesn't make any public appearances. The Communist Party doesn't actually meet for those years and you just think, wow, that's just a weird period for a leader, a dictator like Mao Zedong. He just disappeared, and it's just this weird instance of history. But in 1966, at age 72, Mao reappears for a swim in the Yangtze River, of all places. And now he's back in the public eye, and he starts encouraging what he's calling this great proletarian cultural revolution. And to think back to some communist ideology, the difference between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie own the means of production, while the proletariats are the workers, the everyday people. That's what we mean when we talk about proletarianism. And so, to explain this period a little bit better, I've put a link on another YouTube link for this film clip about the Cultural Revolution that we're about to get into. It's called The East is Red, so I want you to give that a watch. And it should help explain it, a little bit better. But let's get back to Mao here. Mao thinks that the revolution, so the Chinese Revolution, and remember that the Communist Party won that, the Civil War, and now they're in charge. But Mao thinks the revolutionary spirit in China has kind of faltered, and that China needs to get back into that revolutionary spirit. And in order to do this, we get Chairman Mao's Little Red Book as one part of it. And this is what it looks like. In Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, it's just got little sayings to live your life by, I guess we could say. So it's distributed to pretty much everybody in China. It's this massive production where young people especially are encouraged to root out enemies of the people in this little red book, Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. And they could do that by joining the Red Guard. And so here's a little propaganda poster of the Red Guard. And now the Red Guard is supposed to be made up of young people, and these young people would live their lives by Chairman Mao's Little Red Book and root out enemies in China, enemies of the revolution in China. And so they would, as part of being in the Red Guard, they would do things like going after city people that they didn't think were revolutionary enough by destroying foreign books and foreign art, trying to get people to be more Chinese and more in the spirit of the revolution. Now, the impact of this is by 1968, Mao and this other guy named Lin Biao, who we're going to talk about a little more extensively in a second, they're starting to get worried about how they're going to control the Red Guard, the children who are involved in the Red Guard, how they were going to deal with them. Eventually, about 4 million college-age people ended up being exiled to the countryside. If they do return, when they do return, they would be too old to get an education, and they become known as this lost generation in Chinese society. So it is kind of a hectic period in the Chinese world during this time. So here's some more images. This poster here says, "Scatter the old world, build a new world." They're talking about building a new communist world. Here's some more images of burning iconography. Iconoclasm is not a very good deal or thing in a communist ideology. And here is a Chinese intellectual wearing what we might think of as a dunce hat, where he's being labeled as an enemy of the revolution because he's an intellectual. Now, in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, there's a bit of a succession crisis. Mao isn't dead yet, but he's getting pretty old, and it's recognized that he's not going to be around for very long. So one option is this guy Lin Biao, who we talked about a minute ago. But Mao is growing suspicious of Lin because the army gets so much power during that Cultural Revolution, and Lin had been a high-ranking general. So by 1970, Lin Biao's plane crashed mysteriously over Mongolia. The official story was that he ended up staging a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat would be like an overthrow of the government, but he failed and he tried to flee. So that's the official story. It might not be entirely accurate. There are other theories about what happened there, but probably in reality, the Chinese government under Mao's direction crashed Lin Biao's plane, so he was never able to challenge him. But other than Lin Biao, there are two other factions that emerge who as possible successors to Mao in the Cultural Revolution. Now, Mao, for his part, didn't support one of these factions over the other. And the first one was led by this one guy. His name is Zhou Enlai, and just to say something again about pronunciation, is Chinese doesn't translate exactly or even close to very well into English. So when we say, I think his name is more like Zhu, the ZH makes a G sound when it's translated into English. So Zhou Enlai is one possible successor. He was kind of a moderate. Mao Zedong does like him because he kept the country running during the Cultural Revolution. And he had tried to reestablish relations with the United States. The United States had broken off relations with China after their civil war was over. But here you can see him dining with, at the time, this is President Nixon. So here he is having dinner with him, and President Nixon looking kind of put off by the chopsticks. So it's good anyway. So this is Zhou Enlai. The next option was what's known as the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four, they're led by Jiang Qing, who was Mao's third wife, actually. It's a woman, and this isn't a woman here in this picture. That's actually Deng Xiaoping. So Jiang Qing, she is Mao's third wife, and they want to continue with the Cultural Revolution. So that's sort of their, the Zhou Enlai had been the moderates, and the Gang of Four, led by Jiang Qing, they want to continue this revolution, so they're kind of more radical. Now, by 1976, both Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, they die in 1976. So what ends up happening is this guy, Deng Xiaoping, he takes over as a member of the Gang of Four. He takes over power in China and really transforms China. The Gang of Four are actually the real losers here, and so I want you to refer again to that The East is Red documentary about Mao's death, so they get into that a little bit more extensively than we do here. So Deng Xiaoping, he stays as a leader until his death, actually. He officially retired in 1989, but he stayed alive and pretty much in charge until 1997. And he is the person who makes China modern China. He transforms it into a capitalist economy and a socialist state. And China really is a failed socialist state, if we can say anything. Deng saw the failure, and he wants to change it. So it's also important to recognize that the U.S. wanted to open relations with China at this time, and President Nixon, really does a lot to open trade with China for the first time in a long time. Excuse me. So how does Deng change China? And there's a couple of ways. He institutes these reforms in the late 1970s, so he takes over after Mao dies in 1976, and into the early 1980s, he pitches some of these reforms as preserving Mao's legacy, so Mao Zedong's legacy, specifically because he's really popular. He'd been with Mao since as early as the 1930s. So everybody sort of associated him with Mao Zedong. So he pitches these as reforms, preserving Mao's legacy, even though they kind of go against it in certain ways. This first responsibility system one for farmers, which passes in 1981, this is a shift back to that household farming uh, style that had existed before the Great Leap Forward, where farmers would be able to sell their surplus if they had any surplus, and is much more effective than those giant 5 to 10,000 people or person household strong collective farms that Mao wanted. There's also this, so in addition to this responsibility system, we get this new market orientation in industry where people are expected to start producing better quality stuff, better quality goods, more consumer goods, but not 100% consumer goods at this point, as China doesn't really join that globalization that we talked about in the last PowerPoint. So they're leaving behind the command economy to some point. There's also some more freedom for Chinese people to criticize the Chinese past, but not the present, certainly, during this time period. So Deng doesn't want anybody to say anything bad about his methods moving forward, but he opens up a little bit for people to criticize what Mao had done. This actually does lead to an increase in incomes. The per capita income between 1977 and 1987 actually doubles, and in the next decade it doubles again, which leads to, like it does in many other places, an increasing social inequality. Also, a great deal of corruption in China due to the one-party state and stuff. New opportunities usually went to Communist Party members before anybody else. So this growing social inequality leads to social unrest, as you might expect it to. I'll include a video clip from YouTube about the protests leading up to Tiananmen Square, but this was one you might have seen before. This protest in Tiananmen Square it happens between April and June of 1989. It ended up putting a lot of pressure on the Communist Party. Some thought that they should actually open a dialogue. The Communist Party should open a dialogue with the protesters, but that doesn't actually happen. Deng, he decides to send in the army instead. So here we get this sort of famous image of this one man who nobody is sure who he is today. They might know in the archives in China, but nobody is quite sure who this man is standing up to these tanks today. So Deng does send in the army to put down the protests, and after the problems at Tiananmen Square, the protests at Tiananmen Square, Deng tries to further extend the market economy. So we get this socialist market economy that has Chinese characteristics, meaning that it's sort of totalitarian in nature. There is political stability restored afterwards, but there is no extension of democracy, so the protests kind of fail to change the Chinese government. The Communist Party remains in control of the country politically, even to this day. And this is some images of China today showing sort of the big cities, the industrial economy as represented by the amount of traffic there. But there's also some areas that remain rather poor, and you can see these houses here are in pretty bad condition. And just to go back to this one, I'll let you get the rest of it. So that's our slide on, or PowerPoint on China. And if you have any questions, please let us know in the comments. And if anybody has any insights, please let us know in the weekly comments section. And I will see you when we talk about India next time.